Hello, everybody. It's Tom Heilman with the Heilman Group. We're going to get started now and let the last few people come in as we go through the initial slides. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to be presenting on the role of ADA compliance in the future of the web. Kate Penrod will be doing this presentation here. Just wanted to go through a few housekeeping notes to start. So we want to make this an interactive session. So please submit your questions through the GoToWebinar interface, and we'll be compiling those to answer at the end. And if we're not able to get them all answered, we'll follow up with a follow-up blog post that can get through as many of those as we possibly can. I know many people have already submitted questions, so we're going to be incorporating those as well. Don't worry about scrambling to take notes. Now we're going to have a follow-up. We'll send an email, and then we'll also have the video recorded, and so that you can have access to the deck afterwards to kind of go through any of your questions that you may have. Finally, if you want to live tweet during it, please feel free to use hashtag highlight to share it out there. We'd appreciate that, getting the word out for these things as well. Also, after the fact, if you have any questions or anything else you'd like us to cover, we're working on our webinar series on an ongoing basis. So if there's topics that you'd like to have us addressed or added on, or if there's maybe after this webinar something that you saw that you'd like us to explore in more depth, please let us know, and we'll certainly consider that for our future webinars and future material. So I'm the host for today, but Kate's going to be doing all the heavy lifting as we go through the accessibility. Kate's a visual designer on our team, and you can see her contact information on the screen. Feel free to reach out to her if you have any questions about the topic. Kate is extremely passionate about accessibility, inclusive design, and all the facets that we're going to talk about today, so I'm sure she'd be happy to answer that. So without further ado, Kate, I'm going to let you take it away.
Thanks so much, Tom, for that introduction. Like you said, my name is Kate. I am a visual designer here, and I'm just going to take you through today's agenda real quick. We're going to talk about accessibility versus usability, what is ADA web compliance, legal ramifications, recommended process, which is POUR, inclusive design, best practices, and then we will have a key takeaway, and then we can get to some of the questions you guys sent in. Once again, if you have questions throughout, please feel free to submit them, and we will do our best to answer as many as we can. So first up, usability versus accessibility. When we're thinking about websites, you know, usability is the biggest thing about it that we necessarily need to make sure is correct. So usability is all about designing to achieve specific objectives, be efficient, and ultimately provide a satisfying experience. You know, basics of UX design. However, on the other side of that, there's accessibility. Accessibility focuses on creating a site that is usable to those with disabilities. When normally doing UX design, we're not strictly sitting there thinking of all these use cases of people who may need a little extra help viewing your website. That's where accessibility comes in. Yes, there are similarities between the both of them, and there is an overlap, and we're going to get to that overlap a little later in our webinar today. So going back to usability versus accessibility, would you build a bridge that only a specific type of car can use? The same goes for websites and web experiences. Why would you build something that only a certain group of people can use? Did you know that 1/5 of the world's population has some form of a disability? That's 20%. And while not all of those disabilities affect a person's ability to use the web, there is a possibility that up to 20% of your user base cannot use your website in its original form. That's potentially a lot of lost money, especially if you are dealing with any type of transactions. So next, we're going to go over some of the disability types that would be affected with normal websites. There's vision, hearing, cognitive and learning, and physical and motor skills. Vision and hearing together actually make up half of the total amount of disability, so around 10%. But we don't just want to cater our websites to just be usable for vision and hearing disabilities. We have to think of these other two. So where did ADA web compliance come from? So when the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed in 1990, obviously the web was still young. It's really not existing at all at that point, truthfully. So it wasn't a big deal to really focus on any of that when they were talking about the rest of the usability for people with disabilities. In 1998, Section 508 was added to the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and that required all electronic information used by government to be accessible to people with disabilities. That's known as Title II, and those are Title II websites. We're going to get to more of that in the next slide. But in 1999, the first Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or the WCAG, which we'll refer to it through here on out, went into effect. This was published by the World Wide Web Consortium, W3C, and it included the 3 levels of priority, A, AA, and AAA. Single A starting at the easiest to accomplish, with AAA going above and beyond what is needed to create a usable website. It was broken into 14 principles, and WCAG 1.0 was very HTML specific. It was 1999 after all. We didn't have the bells and whistles of the web as we have today. So talking about the WCAG and Title II, what are some of these legal ramifications? I know that's a big factor behind, do we make a compliant website? What do we do about all of this? Currently, there are no laws surrounding Title III based websites, only Title II. So Title III is defined as commercial and public facilities such as stores, restaurants, public businesses, etc. And then Title II, like we mentioned before, is in reference to state and local governments and all public sector websites. If you're in that sector, your site needs to be WCAG 2.0 compliant, and that was added in a Section 508 update that by January 18th of this year, they had to update to those standards. But as we're looking at this, there is nothing spelled out for Title III currently, but that doesn't mean that there still aren't lawsuits surrounding that. We also have to keep in mind the different international laws surrounding accessibility. A great example is AOTA, which is up in Ontario, Canada. They are much stricter on their version of what our Title III websites are. So if you have any type of international business dealings, it would be smart to look up to see if there are any international laws surrounding your sector of websites or business. Also, in 2007, there was a minimum of 814 federal lawsuits that were filed for inaccessible websites. And that's just on the federal side. That doesn't include state lawsuits that were filed. Last year, for example, in California alone, a minimum of 115 lawsuits were filed due to the non-discrimination laws that were going on. So as we can see, while there may not be laws surrounding it, these lawsuits are coming in. And we're going to actually take a look at a couple of them real quick. So we're going to start off with probably one of the highest profile ones with one of the largest payouts. So this all started back in 2005. The National Federation of the Blind sent Target a letter about the lack of alt text on their website. Online purchases could not be completed without a mouse. The locations map was inaccessible for keyboard navigation and also for screen readers. And the headings needed for navigation were missing. Target did not take any action to fix any of these items on their website. So what happened in 2008, they settled a class action lawsuit for $6 million. And that's a lot of money. I don't know about you, but to me, that is a lot of money. So this is just the very beginning of what we're going to see in an inconsistency with the lawsuits coming up. Because in March of last year, Robles versus Domino's Pizza, what happened was the plaintiff was not able to order online due to inaccessibility for screen readers. I believe at the time they were actually running an order online campaign, which is why all of this came about. Domino's argued that they provided phone-based accommodations with a 24/7 in certain locations, accessibility call-in, and that they would make exceptions for those who could not access their online ordering system. And in that case, the judge dismissed it, said there was due to the lack of laws surrounding Title III websites, which Domino's fell under, and because of the provided evidence. So Domino's got let off the hook in this situation. And then here's where inconsistency really starts to get a little hairy. June of last year, Gill versus Winn-Dixie stores. The plaintiff argued that the screen readers were unable to assist in ordering prescriptions and printing coupons. Mind you, a big argument of this, of what Winn-Dixie was fighting against, was that he was still able to get to the store to pick up his prescriptions. Nothing was stopping him from doing that. However, the court did side with the plaintiff in this matter, and Winn-Dixie is forced to update the site to AA WCAG 2.0 standards. They also held Winn-Dixie responsible for all third-party plugins, and that right there was big, because in the past, third-party plugins, you weren't really held responsible for because it was the third party's fault. Now, with this being done, everyone needs to start looking at what plugins they're using on their website. So what can we do as designers, developers, marketers to ensure that our websites aren't going to start ending up in front of a judge? That's where the WCAG 2.0 comes into play. You've heard me mention it a couple times already throughout the webinar. What it is, it's the current standard in web guidelines. The most current version that we're using was published in 2008, but they're currently working on 2.1, which is slated to come out mid this year. And beyond that, what they call Project Silver, which is version 3, which is coming at an undisclosed date currently. So major changes from WCAG 1.0 saw that the guidelines were being more principle-centered rather than solely focusing on technique. The rating system stayed the same, but instead of 14 pillars that they had before, they broke it into 4, and that is POUR. So what is POUR? POUR stands for Perceivable, Operable, Understandable, and Robust. These are the 4 pillars which all accessible websites are based under. We're going to start with Perceivable. So Perceivable is where all content should be able to be perceived by the 3 relevant senses: sight, hearing, and touch. Smell-o-vision has not yet reached the World Wide Web, fortunately, so we are going to be unable to deal with smell and taste. So first off, we're going to start with sight. Most important way of communicating information on the web. So what that means is that the visually impaired need to be able to use assistive technologies to use your website. Audio formats are the most popular way to perceive visual communications this way, so we need to make sure that our content is able to be picked up by screen readers for those who cannot see. Hearing. Audio interactions are increasing as technologies mature and become more available. That I'm sure you've seen a lot more videos starting to pop up, not only on your social media feeds, but also on websites. We need to make sure we include written transcripts and subtitles when using sound or music on website. We can't assume that everyone's going to be able to hear what we're providing. And touch. For those who are both deaf and blind, they rely on touch to communicate. This is where refreshable Braille devices can convert the text from our web pages to a Braille output so they can navigate their way around. But if our text is not able to be picked up by screen readers, it's most likely not going to be able to be picked up by Braille outputters as well. Also, content needs to be able to be transformed from one form to another. Going back to the 3 relevant senses on the screen before, we have to be able to have the text be perceived in different ways. And not just text, but the information. So an example is making sure that we use relevant alt text on images for screen readers to pick up. Also, video transcriptions and closed captioning. Not only will using video transcriptions and closed captioning help those who aren't able to watch your videos and help those with vision impairments, but they also are great for timeline scrolling on Facebook, Instagram, all of that. It can only increase the views that you get, especially when people don't have headphones around to listen to it. So kind of a double-edged sword there. Affects everyone. Also, content needs to be able to be distinguishable from design elements. So this means that color cannot be the only element to denote a link. You usually see sometimes little carrots, underline, any type of text decoration that can help a link stand off from just using color. We need to be able to use that. Also, color contrast. And this is a big one, and one that I fight every day is making sure the color contrast is good enough on a website. Small text needs to be 4.5 to 1, and large text 3.5 to 1 in terms of the contrast there. So large text also is defined as anything over 18 point on most fonts. In order to check that, there are color contrast checkers out there that can help you. And don't worry, your logos and text that's used purely for decoration are exempt from these contrast rules. You do not need to change your logo colors for that contrast. So here's some examples. Good alt text is an Xbox One, S console controller, and games over on that right-hand side. Bad alt text. This photo here for the garden center, it says category recommendations garden center. That does not say what's in the photo. It's saying what the category label is. So we need to alt text for what the photo is and not what the action of the photo is. Also, some color contrast fails, you could say. San Diego Zoo, they have that title right there, live cams. The ratio is 2.33. Because that text is about 36 size, it needs to be 3.5 to 1. So color contrast is not up to par. Same with their link color below. It needs to be a 4.5 to 1 for the ratio, but it's 2.6. Something else, and if you picked this out by looking at it, Gold Star, but they are not using any other text decoration element to show that those, like Panda Cam, Polar Cam, that those are links. It's just text with a color. That's not compliant. Operable. So operable means that websites should be able to adapt to all methods of operation. So methods of input devices. Mouse, keyboard, trackpad, touchscreen, voice input, switch control, eye tracker. That's all the different ways that we can navigate through a website. You and I are used to just using probably a mouse and a trackpad. We need to make sure that people can use their keyboards and some of these other devices to get through a website. So keyboard accessibility is seen as one of the most important principles of web accessibility. That just goes to show that, let's say someone who's paralyzed wants to be able to use a website. That's where they can use these voice inputs. Or dominant hand is broken. Maybe someone with a tremor, they're not able to really use a mouse. They don't trust their hands to use the mouse. They're going to be tabbing through their keyboard and using keyboard commands. So examples of requirements for a site to be operable. We need to find and navigate through and interact with web content. And so that's not just with your mouse. We need to be able to use a keyboard as well and all these other forms of input. You need to be able to bypass extraneous or irrelevant content, and we have an example of that on the next screen to kind of show a little bit of what that is. But that goes when you're using your keyboard and these other methods besides a mouse and trackpad to go through a website. You can jump through content easily. So example, skip navigation links, which we have on the next slide. Have unlimited time to complete tasks. I'm sure everyone's seen when they go into Ticketmaster, you have 8 minutes to purchase your tickets. That can be extremely daunting for someone who may have cognitive abilities and they just don't know how they're going to accomplish this in that amount of time. So having settings or being able to change the settings to have unlimited time for these is where you're going to be operable in that manner. Having the ability to control media players, animations, and other type of time-dependent content. So we already do this with video with play and pause buttons. Animations, though, is another way we can start bringing this in because you need to be cognizant of flickering and strobing for those with seizures. So being able to pause it if they have a feeling that it's going to trigger there, that's really big. Same with sliders for your carousel. Pause and play buttons are key. And error recovery. This is where we want to build in confirmation screens, error alerts, and warnings. And that should be an integral part of the UX on your site. And that's so that someone who may have a tremor may not accidentally, hit the closeout button and lose everything they were working on. And I mean, in my case, sending an email to someone that you didn't mean to send it to, being able to pull it back. But that's where some of these error recoveries and also these confirmation screens can help. So keyboard-only navigation, like we mentioned before. On the left, we see as you start tabbing through Samsung's site, which is a great site, it's very accessible. The first thing that's going to pop up is a skip to content link, and that's that first image at the top. If someone wanted to skip through all the navigation, they'd be able to skip directly to the content without having to hit that tab key on your keyboard over and over and over again to get through. Also hit it again, skip to accessibility help. Not everyone offers that, but it's great Samsung does. That means that someone will be able to key in their different settings that they want for that time on the website. You're also able to tab through the navigation into the flyout menus, which is very important. And a bad example, not sure if you heard of Cluster Truck. They're a local delivery company here in Cleveland for food. We use them all the time here, but you cannot tab through their online ordering platform. So that's kind of a problem. Someone can't order food. Understandable. So this means that the website should be easy to understand and not cause confusion or ambiguity. So what this means is wording should be simple and concise. You want to make sure that you're writing to your audience, so don't use very complicated terminology or even complicated medical terminology for an audience that you suspect only has a 9th grade reading level. You want to make sure you're writing to who is going to be using your site. You want to consider alternative representation for better understanding. So that means always make sure there are images to go along with your text. You want to supplement that as much as possible. Illustrations, videos, images, all of that can help people with reading disabilities and cognitive abilities better understand your content. But always remember to provide captions with those as well so the screen readers can pick it up. Navigation should be consistent across the entire website and easy to understand and follow. I think that's simple enough to understand. Don't change your top-level navigation from page to page. Also, make sure you're naming, if you have a blog on your website in the navigation, make sure it's labeled blog. Bring those fun headlines and titles in to the inside screens. All forms and UI controls need to be properly labeled. This is so screen readers can properly go through the website and people know where they are at all times. Provide instructions and guidance when necessary. If you're having the user do something out of the norm on your website, complete a transaction using a different form of transaction method, this is where instructions really come in handy. Those with cognitive abilities and just a regular user in general could really benefit from those. Use meaningful text in all buttons and links. Read more and learn more are not appropriate links. I know it's the easiest one. It just defaults. It always fits in the button and in the space. But if you're using a screen reader to go through a site, if something were to happen and it jostles around, it just goes, read more. What are you reading more on? What are you learning more on? Always try to at least put a little more text in there. And also apply proper heading level specifications. Similar to what we mentioned about all forms and UI controls needing to be properly labeled, same for heading levels. We need to make sure that the screen readers know where they're going. So just some examples. These are some heading structures. A very good example is Wikipedia. If you land on any Wikipedia article and you look at how the headings are structured, you know exactly where you're at all times. You know what goes under which part of the article, and you're never going to get lost. On the flip side, Giant Eagle, sorry to pick on you guys, but this is not the greatest example of heading structures. We see in the H1 where there should be more of a headline, it's actually the URL. We have levels that are skipped, and it's a little confusing. If you were on a screen reader, this is how all of these would be portrayed to you. And I don't know about you, but I wouldn't know where I was in this website if I was listening to it that way. And robust. Robust is probably the simplest to get through because it all has to do about technologies and operating systems. Responsive websites are a must. Adaptive sites are not acceptable for accessibility due to the lack of effort put into the tablet views. So we need to make sure that the site being responsive is going to be able to be used across all methods of platforms and all operating systems. With that, content should be developed to work across many different versions of browsers. Don't leave out any of your browsers when you're testing. Even test the more obscure ones. You want to make sure it works. You never know. Users should be able to choose their own technologies to access web content. And with that, that allows customization to those with accessibility needs. So needing to zoom into a site, don't turn off any of the zooming capabilities. Also, with all the plugins happening and coming about, especially in Google Chrome, for example, someone can go in and start changing the contrast levels on a website. You want to make sure that you're allowing your CSS pages to be editable that way. I know those designers, you're cringing, you're like, oh, you're changing my designs, but for accessibility, it needs to be done. Also, don't rush development. Clean HTML will work better than sloppy, hacked-together HTML any day of the week. And don't focus too much on limitations of old technologies. Instead, focus on current and future possibilities. WebAIM, who is, they're a big group who does a lot with accessibility. They're at the forefront of trying to figure out new ways to do everything for this. They administered a survey to those who use screen readers, and they indicated that the majority of users tend to use up-to-date technology and up-to-date browsers. So, when you're thinking about, oh, screen readers, old antiquated tech, not so much. They're trying to stay as up-to-date as you and I are. So in other words, build your websites to this. Beautiful, sleek, new computers, and not to this. We don't have floppy drives anymore, so this doesn't even work. Earlier when we talked about usability and accessibility, I mentioned about the overlap and what that is. So when both of these overlap each other, we get inclusive design. Now, inclusive design has been around for a little bit, but it's probably something that you haven't heard much of because it's kind of been on the rise lately. What is it? So inclusion design, is the practice of designing and programming products, in this case websites, to be usable by everyone to the greatest extent possible. Sounds like accessibility, right? Well, here's where it starts to differ. We start to bring in different situations. So the quality of the hardware, internet connectivity, computer literacy, levels of education, language, age, and also disability. And this is where we start talking about both the permanent and the situational disability. When I was talking about needing to tab through a website because you broke your dominant hand, this is where that situational disability comes into play. So why is this an important idea? It expands the use cases to include more than lifelong disabilities, which is what accessibility focuses on the most. And while that's extremely important, we want to make sure that we are creating use cases for our websites to be used across the board at all times. It also enhances the usability of ADA compliant standards on the web. So we're taking what we're already building in accessibility and making it even better. And because of that, it leads to a more usable and innovative website. I have some great examples on the next slide, and you'll see exactly what I mean. But just one more thing, when we're dealing with inclusion design, and this also goes back to accessibility design, this is not something you can rush. Research is a large part of a successful, inclusively designed website. Don't rush through that beginning research process. You want to make sure that you're including enough use cases. You want to make sure that you have enough personas. There are more steps to add to your user experience portion of your web design. but it will just improve the usability of your website. So, scenario, cell phone sizes are getting larger, but our hands are not. I'm sure all iPhone users have accidentally hit the middle button a few times and your entire platform just slides down all those buttons. That's actually probably one of the most well-known, but not even realized, examples of inclusive design. So those larger phones, smaller hands, you can't reach the top. I know it seems silly to be talking about it, but it takes a use case of someone who may have a smaller hand, or who knows, maybe they even have limited mobility in their hands, and makes it just easier to reach the top apps on their phone. So I'm sure all iPhone users have seen this. Now to a different form of inclusive design. A panicked mother is looking for an emergency room. So this goes back to use cases. Let's say a mother and her child, they're not in an area that they are familiar with, maybe at a party, birthday party. Daughter falls down, breaks her wrist. Frantic, needs to find an emergency room. You know they're hurt, you just want to help. Stressful situation, and the only thing you want to do is find the nearest emergency room that's not going to have a long wait time. Well, yes, we can, start Googling as much as we can. The last thing I'm going to guess that woman wants to do is start clicking through all these links that say they're for the emergency room, but they're not. And then also going to that page and not even finding where that emergency room is, but also maybe the wait time isn't even on the website. I know sometimes billboards will have wait time for the nearest ER. That's something maybe we should think about putting on the website as well. So taking situational instances and trying to solve them through the website, that's kind of what inclusive design is. And while I understand that we cannot build to every situation under the sun, the best we can do to try to build for it, the better experience we're going to have on the web as a whole. So we're going to hop over to some best practices. You want to make sure your whole team is aligned on the overall accessibility goals before you start your project. If it's something that pops up as soon as the designs are done and you realize, oh, we have to redo everything and go back to UX, it's just going to be a problem. So make sure it's defined at the beginning of the project and everyone is on board. Consider creating personas geared towards those with disabilities or to someone who would use your website in a non-ideal situation. Similar to the example on the previous screen with the mom looking for an emergency room, you want to make sure that you can try to anticipate your user's needs and build to what they're going to be looking for to make it an easier experience. Think beyond lifelong disabilities and think about everyday situations and injuries that can impede a user's ability to use the site. That doesn't mean throw out accessibility guidelines out the window. You still want to implement those into your site. We're just building upon them now and trying to think of ways to make it even easier to use for other groups of people. For optimal contrast, you want to be open to web-safe color palettes for your website. While your logo may not have optimal contrast, we need to look at the colors that you want to use on your site. If your brand colors aren't passing the contrast tests, then we need to create, a web-safe color palette. This could just mean very minimal tweaks on the color side, and you may not even notice them once you see it on the screen. All content that is not text-based should be provided alongside a text equivalent. So you want to make sure all images have descriptive alt text, not text saying what the action of that image is doing. Also, text transcriptions should be provided for videos and audio media. Once again, this not only will help those who have disabilities and can't see the videos happening, but it'll also help on social media as well, getting more views for those who may not be able to turn the volume on. Always use transcripts. Content should be easy to understand and follow. For example, buttons and links should contain meaningful text. Learn more is not acceptable. That's probably one of the easiest things that everyone can start fixing right now on their site. Take a look at your content. A well-organized site is key. Screen readers need to be able to get through the site easy enough, and this is the best way to do it, by well organization. And label everything. You can never have too many labels at once, or too many labels on your site, I should say. The more labels, the merrier. So if there's one key takeaway I can have you all leave with, it's this quote from WebAIM, who I described earlier as being a great resource for accessibility in websites. It's most of the time, these adaptions benefit nearly everyone, not just people with disabilities. Almost everyone benefits from helpful illustrations, properly organized content, and clear navigation. So do not feel like accessibility is going to take away from the creativity of your site. You can still have a beautiful, well-written, well-designed website, and well-built for our developers out there, and still have it be accessible. It may take a little more time, but that's where the teamwork comes in. Work together with every member on your team, make sure everyone's on the same page, and your website's going to be amazing. And that's all I have.
Thanks, Kate. That was a great presentation. Lots of information there. So if anyone has questions that they want to ask, I believe a few have come in via the go to webinar. Please feel free to ask more questions now. I'm going to start with a couple ones that we've already gotten in, Kate, and get your ideas here. We have a few minutes, so unfortunately we won't be able to get to all the questions, but we certainly will follow up with the following blog post to cover anything we didn't get through. One quick question that came in, pretty tactical question. How do you determine the ratios? Where do you go online for it? Is there software that you can use to determine the contrast ratios, or what do you recommend there?
Yeah, so there are a ton of different resources you can use. You can Google, and a bunch of contrast checkers will come up. My favorite is called Tangaguru, I believe it's called.
Tangaguru, is that right?
Tangaguru, yes. I prefer Tangaguru mainly because I can also get suggestions on colors that are within the accessibility ranges for contrast. And that's why I prefer that. So if I'm getting a color from a client who may not necessarily be within the contrast ratio, it'll start giving suggestions of either changing what the color is or also what the background color is, because we also have to remember, if you're putting colors on top of backgrounds besides white, that the contrast ratio still has to be there. So you can either have it tell you the main color or the background color. And that's the one that we prefer to use here. That's not the only one, mind you. WebAIM has a couple references to a few if you go on there. And I also believe that the WCAG has a few just referenced on their site as well.
Okay, and that was Tangaguru, GURU.com, and I think that's contrast-finder at tangaguru.com.
Yes.
The tool itself. Great, thank you for that.
Yep.
So there's a lot of kind of trade-offs that I saw during the presentation in terms of what to look at and how to best address that. One of the things, I guess, one of our attendees asked was, where does accessibility fall in the entire list of kind of priorities? Because obviously there's a lot of trade-offs with accessibility.
Yeah.
Versus content, versus cost, versus security. In terms of where do you see that falling?
So I think it really depends on what your goal for the website is and who your main audience is going to be. If you know that you are in an area where there may be a lot of people with different vision impairments or hearing impairments, then I would make accessibility a high up on your list of priorities. It also depends on what sector you're in: healthcare, finance, education. All three of those, it should be one of the primary priorities, along with security though as well, because all three of those have high security risks. So, and in terms of the priorities on when you're building the website, it needs to be defined up front with the rest of the mandatories. It's not something you want to get halfway through and then you find out, oh, we need this to be WCAG 2.0. Make sure that's decided upon and defined at the beginning, along with what all the other questions you would have, like what CMS are you using? Should this be ADA compliant? That's when you need to really define all this.
Great. No, thanks Thank you for that. I agree. So it's a constant set of trade-offs that we have to do, because in no project do we have infinite time and infinite budget to get
Exactly.
things done, right? So we've got to tailor that based on the audience and the overall business priorities. One other question that we had was, what are some of the best ways to kind of test and validate that your designs are compliant? Because obviously, as you go through the design process and you're iterating through that, what's the kind of best way to take a quick cut at testing whether your design is going to be compliant for implementation?
No, that's a great question. So there are, along with the color contrast checker, that's one way to test and validate your site. That has to be done by hand, though. I do not trust any of the site crawlers. One, which I advise to use for code-based, which is wave.webaim, I believe it is. And what you do is you input your site, and it'll start spitting out if you have any things you need to fix on your website in terms of accessibility. It's great, but I don't trust it for color contrast because it reads the entire site, and color contrast, as we mentioned before, is situational. So if your logo is not within that contrast, that's perfectly fine because it doesn't have to be, because logos have alt text with them, which don't forget your alt text on your logos. I will say that. So I advise wave.webaim for testing your site overall. As for color, you need to do that manually with one of the color contrast checkers out there. And you also need to test both your keyboard accessibility and your voice accessibility in the screen readers manually as well. There's not going to be a program that's going to be able to do that for you. If you are worried about some of the things that one of those automated platforms are showing you, then I advise to check it by hand. Get your developer to look into the code, match it up against some of the examples that WCAG has. They are a great resource, especially for developers out there. They have a lot of information on what to do, what not to do, and best case scenarios for things. So when in doubt, you're going to have to check it by hand, but a few of those tools can help speed up the process.
Great. So it kind of sounds like you can use the tools to start with, but if you want the detailed, real granular view that you can trust, you got to do a lot of that work manually.
Yeah, and I will say also there are some people out there that say that they offer certifications on web accessibility. They aren't accredited or anything like that. It's just a service that they offer. You can use them. I'm not saying not to, but if you really need help with them, I say contact someone who really knows and understands web accessibility. And then also, like I said, when in doubt, check everything by hand.
Great. So one final question we have here, because I know we're getting towards the end. Yeah, I think it's a key takeaway. If there was one thing to do, one thing that you could leave the audience with to make a website more accessible, what would that be?
Ooh, there are so many different things that are easy to accomplish. I'm going to say two, actually. The first one is make sure your alt tags are correct. You don't want them to be, talking about what the link is doing, or you don't want it to advertise your sale. You want it to actually say what the product is in the image or what the image is. Like that Home Depot one that we showed in an example, it was a bunch of hanging flower pots, and the alt tag was product category garden center. The alt tag should have been red flowers in hanging pots, something like that. That's one of the easiest. Also, I would say the context of your links. Those are two very simple things that if your CMS allows it, you don't need to contact your agency or a developer to change those. You should be able to do that just within your CMS, is just changing your content and updating alt tags. Those are the easiest, I think, now I know if you have a very large site with a lot of images, you're sitting there saying, this is not easy, we got to change them all. But, without having to involve technology and developers, I think those are the easiest ones to accomplish and the most important ones.
Great. Thank you. I know it's never easy to pick one thing, but hopefully our audience can get a couple items out of that they can take back today to look at their existing web properties for that. So Kate, thanks once again. I know you're extremely passionate about the topic, and I know you put a lot of time and effort into the presentation, and you're very thoughtful here. So thank you for that. And anyone who has follow-up questions, certainly will send them in, and we'll certainly get back to you. First, I want to thank the audience. I want to give you 10 minutes back in your day, because I'm sure at Heilman Group we always try to have our meetings and everything end on time, so that you can get back to the next part of your day. We appreciate you spending the time with us, and hopefully you learned a little bit today. I also wanted to let you know in June we have another webinar coming up, something near and dear to my heart. How do you develop your MarTech stack? So we're very passionate about marketing, integrating technology in that at Heilman Group, and hopefully you'll join us for that. And then just wanted to say a final thank you and happy marketing.